They left a starving canine German Shepherd puppy on thin ice. What happened next moved the entire town. When a tiny canine German Shepherd puppy was found trembling, starving, and stranded on a sheet of cracking ice, no one believed he would survive. Abandoned in the dead of winter and left to die, his cries were barely audible through the wind. But then, something happened that no one expected. A moment so powerful, it brought an entire town to tears. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story that proves hope can be found in the coldest moments. This isn't just about survival. It's about the bond between a broken dog and a forgotten man, and how they saved each other when the world turned away. The wind howled across the frozen lake in the outskirts of Dalton, a small, snow-covered town in northern Minnesota. Locals knew better than to step foot on Stillwater Lake this time of year. The ice was fragile, deceptive, hiding danger beneath its glassy beauty. But that morning, just after sunrise, someone heard a sound. A whimper. Barely a whisper through the wind. Daryl Thompson, a retired firefighter in his early 60s, was out walking near the edge of the lake with his thermos of coffee and an old camera slung over his shoulder. Ever since his wife passed, he'd taken to these cold walks, a way to remember the silence they used to share. He almost turned back when he heard it again. A cry. He froze. At first, he thought it was the wind playing tricks, the way it sometimes bends trees or creaks through cabins. But then he saw it. A small, dark figure, barely visible against the blue-white sheet of ice near the center of the lake. Moving, shivering, trying to stand. It was a puppy. Daryl squinted. "No," he muttered under his breath. The animal was trapped, surrounded by a spiderweb of cracks. The thin ice beneath it looked ready to give way at any moment. The old man's breath quickened. His firefighter instincts kicked in. Even after retirement, some habits never fade. He ran. Not onto the ice. Not yet. First, he grabbed his phone, calling 911. Then he scanned the tree line and spotted an old canoe someone had left half buried in snow. It was heavy, but he dragged it to the edge, careful not to slip on the frozen shore. He called out, trying to keep his voice calm. "Hey boy, stay still, I'm coming." The puppy's ears perked, but he didn't wee. His tiny frame trembled. He was no older than 4 months, with matted fur and ribs clearly showing beneath his skin. Daryl pushed the canoe onto the ice, climbing inside and using a long branch to slowly paddle his way across. The ice groaned under the weight, echoing across the lake like a warning. Halfway there, a loud crack shot through the air. Daryl stopped breathing. The ice held. Inch by inch, he moved forward, sweat freezing on his brow. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, he reached the puppy. The dog didn't bark or whimper now. He simply looked up, eyes wide, too weak to move. Daryl reached out slowly, whispering, "It's okay, boy. I got you." He wrapped the puppy in his coat, pulling him close to his chest. The poor thing didn't resist. He just buried his face into the warmth and let out a sound that shattered Daryl's heart. A soft, defeated sigh. With one arm around the dog, Daryl pushed the canoe back toward land. The ice cracked again, louder this time, but held until he reached the shore. Paramedics were already pulling up in their truck, slipping on snow chains as they jumped out with blankets and gear. One of them, a young woman named Kara, gasped, "Is that a German Shepherd pup?" Daryl nodded, still kneeling in the snow, holding the bundle of fur against his chest. "He's canine bred," he said softly. "Look at the markings. Somebody abandoned him." They rushed the pup to the animal clinic down the road, but Daryl didn't leave his side, not for a second. As they worked to warm the dog's body, check his vitals, and start IV fluids, Daryl stood in the corner of the exam room, arms crossed, eyes locked on the table, The vet looked up. If he had been out there 10 more minutes, Daryl didn't let her finish. But he wasn't. Later that night, when the puppy opened his eyes and saw Daryl sitting there, he did something unexpected. He licked the old man's hand, then rested his tiny head on his boot. And just like that, Daryl's heart, frozen since the day his wife died, cracked open again. But this rescue was only the beginning, because what Daryl didn't know was that this wasn't just any puppy. This was a puppy with a purpose and a secret buried deep in his bloodline that would soon change everything. 3 days had passed since Daryl pulled the puppy from the cracking ice. Snow still blanketed Dalton, but the pup, now nicknamed Ice by the vet techs, had made it through the worst. Warm blankets, quiet care, and food had done their work. He wasn't strong yet, but he could lift his head, and his eyes. They had changed. The look of fear was still there, buried beneath layers of exhaustion and betrayal. But something new flickered now too. Trust. Daryl sat on the bench in the animal clinic's recovery room, a travel mug of coffee between his palms and a blanket folded beside him. Ice lay curled up in the corner, resting, but every few minutes, his gaze would drift to the man who had saved him, just to make sure he was still there. Kara, the young paramedic who had helped during the rescue, walked in with a folder in her hands. "We found something," she said, her voice careful. Daryl stood slowly. "Found what?" She handed him the folder. Inside was a series of photos and a vet report. Daryl's eyes narrowed. Across Ice's belly and hind legs were small, circular burns. He hadn't seen them before. The fur had hidden most of it. But under careful examination, they'd revealed a story no pup could speak aloud. "These are from a cattle prod," Kara said, frowning. "And look here," she pointed to the back of Ice's ear. Beneath the fur, barely visible, was a faint tattoo. Daryl leaned closer, his firefighter instincts stirred again. "What is that?" "It's a military canine breeder's code. I looked it up. This pup was part of a shipment, bred for service mold. He was supposed to be trained as a future police or military dog." Daryl's heart sank. "So what happened?" "Something went wrong. The breeder reported 3 puppies missing last month. They suspect theft, but no arrests. Someone probably took them, figured out they were too expensive to keep or couldn't sell them without paperwork, and dumped them." Daryl stared through the window where Ice lay resting. "They just threw him onto a frozen lake?" Kara nodded. "Left him to die." The words hung in the air like frost. Daryl clenched his jaw. His hands shook slightly. Not from the cold, but from the memory of another rescue long ago. One where he hadn't arrived in time. One where a child had fallen through ice and never resurfaced. That boy had been the reason Daryl retired early. The guilt still followed him like a shadow. But now, he had a second chance. He walked into the recovery room, knelt beside Ice, and looked him in the eyes. "You survived hell," he murmured. "But you're not broken. You're here. And I won't let anyone throw you away again." The pup blinked, ears twitching. Daryl reached out slowly. Ice pressed his nose into the man's palm. From that day forward, Daryl visited every morning and every night. He brought cooked chicken in Tupperware, sat and read aloud from his newspaper, rubbed Ice's back gently until the little dog dozed off. The clinic staff started calling Daryl the pup's shadow, and he didn't mind. 1 week later, the vet gave the news. Ice was stable. He could be discharged. Kara met Daryl in the parking lot. "What happens now?" Daryl looked down at the leash in his hand, then at the dog whose fur had grown softer, whose ribs were no longer sharp, whose eyes now searched the world with curiosity. "I take him home," Daryl said. "You sure about that?" Daryl gave a slow, steady nod. "He needs someone. And maybe I do too. As the sun set behind the snowy trees, Ice stepped cautiously into Daryl's old pickup truck. He sniffed the seat, then curled into a ball, like it was the only place in the world he'd ever wanted to be. Daryl climbed in beside him, started the engine, and pulled out onto the road. Neither of them knew it yet, but what began as a rescue was about to become a redemption. And the real test? It was still waiting for them, just beyond the trees. The first night at Daryl's cabin was quiet. Too quiet. Nestled deep in the woods, the place had once been filled with laughter, Sunday music, and the smell of pine wood crackling in the fireplace. Now, only the ticking of a wall clock and the occasional hoot of an owl marked the passing hours. Ice had circled the old rug 3 times before curling up at Daryl's feet near the fire. Daryl sat in his recliner, flipping slowly through a photo album he hadn't touched in years. Pictures of his wife, her laugh frozen in time, pages stiff from age and memory. He looked down at the pup. "You ever been in a home before, boy?" he asked softly. "Or is this all new to you?" Ice twitched an ear, but didn't lift his head. By midnight, the snow had thickened. The storm rolled in fast. Sharp wind, blowing flakes, and a heavy darkness that swallowed the trees outside. Daryl threw another log on the fire, then checked the windows. Everything was fine. Until the sound came. A long, low howl. Not from Ice, but from the woods. Daryl stiffened. It wasn't a coyote, and it wasn't close, but something about it felt wrong. Like Mon stretched into a sound, a second howl followed, then silence. Ice jumped up, hackles raised. He ran to the window, paws on the ledge, eyes locked on the forest beyond. Daryl walked over. "What is it?" The pup growled softly. Then, without warning, he bolted toward the door. "Hey, wait!" Daryl called, grabbing the leash. But the dog pawed the wood and whimpered, his entire body tense. Daryl had seen that look before, years ago on the face of a search and rescue canine just before they found a lost girl in the mountains. Ice knew something was out there. Daryl opened the door slowly, wind hitting his face like a slap. Snow swept across the porch, erasing footprints almost instantly. "All right," he muttered, bundling up. "Let's go find out." Together they stepped into the storm. Ice led the way, nose low, tail stiff, pulling gently on the leash. Daryl followed, boots crunching through the fresh snow, flashlight cutting through the darkness. They passed the old shed, crossed the field, and entered the woods. A twisting path of bare trees and silence. Then they heard it again. A yelp. Short, desperate. Not from a wild animal. From a dog. Ice barked sharply, pulling harder. Within minutes, they found it. Near a frozen creek, half buried in snow, was another German Shepherd. Older, larger, its leg caught in a steel trap. Blood stained the ice. Daryl cursed under his breath. "Who the hell sets traps like this out here?" He approached slowly, hands raised. "It's okay, girl," he whispered. "I'm here to help." The dog growled weakly, then collapsed into the snow. She was fading fast. Daryl reached into his coat and pulled out a multi-tool, kneeling beside the trap. Ice stood guard, pacing in a small circle, watching every move. With careful pressure, Daryl opened the jaws of the trap, freeing the mangled paw. The injured dog whined but didn't fight. He wrapped the leg with a scarf, bundled the dog in his coat, and lifted her into his arms. Ice followed silently all the way back. It was after 2 a.m. when they got back to the cabin. Daryl laid the injured dog on a blanket beside the fire. She didn't moan, just breathed, shallow and slow. He turned to Ice. "You heard her before anyone else. You led me there." Ice just stared at the other dog, then laid down beside her, resting his chin close as if saying, "You're not alone anymore." That night, Daryl didn't sleep. He sat by the fire with both dogs, the storm roaring outside, and for the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel empty. It felt alive. He didn't know who the injured shepherd belonged to, or how long she'd been out there, but something in his gut told him this wasn't just a coincidence, because Ice hadn't found her by chance. He'd been born for this, and what lay ahead would prove it. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving a blanket of untouched snow over Dalton's woods. Sunlight glinted off the ice-covered trees, casting shards of light across the front porch. Inside the cabin, it was quiet, except for the steady, shallow breathing of the injured dog by the fire and the soft shuffle of Ice's paws as he paced protectively beside her. Daryl crouched down to check the makeshift bandage. "Still holding," he murmured, then gently ran his hand along the older dog's ribs. She flinched, but didn't growl. "She's tough," Kara said, stepping through the doorway with a medical bag. Still in shock, but no broken bones. Just torn muscle and blood loss. "You found her just in time." Daryl nodded. "Ice found her." Kara gave a low whistle, crouching beside the pup. "I'll say it again. He's special." Daryl looked at Ice, who stood near the fireplace, ears alert, eyes constantly shifting between Kara and the injured dump. His focus was sharp, far beyond what you'd expect from a puppy. "I think he's got working bloodlines in him," she added. "Have you noticed how he tracks, listens, how he waited at the door instead of bolting into the woods? Every move he makes is like a soldier," Daryl muttered. Kara opened her bag and pulled out supplies. "If you're serious about keeping him, you should think about training. Real training. He's young, but the instincts are there." Daryl leaned back against the wall, arms crossed. "I haven't trained anything in a long time." She glanced at him. "You trained rookies, didn't you?" He smirked. "Rookies aren't this smart." That afternoon, after the older shepherd, who Daryl had started calling Ghost, drifted into sleep, he brought Ice outside. The sun was high, the air brisk, and the snow thick underfoot. The backyard stretched into woods, a wide open space with logs, stumps, and old tools, perfect for drills. Daryl pulled a tennis ball from his coat pocket. Ice perked up instantly. "You want it?" Daryl teased. The pup sat. No bark, no tail wag, just focus. Daryl raised a brow. "Who taught you that?" He tossed the ball. Ice didn't bolt right away. He watched the arc, tracked it, then sprinted after it with laser precision, catching it just before it hit the snow. He turned on a dime and returned, dropping it neatly at Daryl's feet. "All right," Daryl muttered, impressed. "Let's see what else is buried in that brain of yours." He tried basic commands: sit, stay, come, down. Ice responded with the kind of precision Daryl hadn't seen since his old firehouse canine partner. That dog, named Rex, had saved lives. He'd once pulled a boy from under a collapsed deck after a tornado. Daryl had trusted him with his own life. Watching Ice now sent a chill through his spine. It was like Rex had come back. Smaller, younger, but with the same fire. For the next hour, they worked. Daryl built a small course using wood beams and barrels. He tested Ice's agility, his obedience, his ability to listen under pressure. Each time, Ice didn't just respond. He thrived. And when Daryl called, "Return!" the pup sprinted back, eyes locked on his. That night, Daryl sat on the porch with Ice beside him and Ghost resting inside, finally breathing easier. "You're not just any dog," Daryl whispered. "You were born to serve, but you got tossed out like trash." He rubbed the pup's ears gently. "Well, I'm not letting that happen again." Suddenly, a sound echoed through the woods, a soft howl, different from the night before. Ice stood quickly, tail raised, alert. Daryl turned. Another howl followed, then another. Farther out this time. Ghost limped to the doorway behind them, ears back. "What is it?" Daryl asked, uneasy. Kara's words came back to him. 3 pups went missing. He looked at Ice, who stared into the woods, unmoving, like a compass pointing toward something unseen. "There's more out there, isn't there?" Daryl whispered. And in that moment, he knew this rescue wasn't over. It was only the beginning. Daryl had learned to trust gut feelings during his 30 years as a firefighter. You don't ignore a prickle at the base of your neck or a change in the wind. That night, when Ice stood frozen at the edge of the porch, locked onto something in the woods, Daryl felt it in his bones. Something was out there. The howls had faded, but Ice wouldn't settle. He kept returning to the window or the door, sitting upright, waiting. Ghost paced behind him, her injured paw barely touching the ground. She didn't growl or bark. She just watched Ice like she knew exactly what he was thinking, and agreed with it. By dawn, Daryl made a decision. He brewed a pot of coffee, packed up a thermos, a first aid kit, some dog food, and a flashlight. Then he grabbed his thick coat and a leather harness he hadn't used since Rex. He crouched in front of Ice. "You want to find the others, don't you?" Ice tilted his head, then nosed the door. "All right then." Ghost whined softly. Daryl looked at her. "You're staying. Heal up. I need at least one of you here if we run into trouble." She licked his hand. The harness fit Ice perfectly. Daryl clipped the leash to the chest strap, even though he suspected he wouldn't need it. He wasn't walking a pet anymore. He was following a working dog. And by the look in Ice's eyes, the mission had already started. They set off down the back trail, the snow crunching beneath their boots and paws. The air was biting, but Ice didn't slow. Nose down, ears forward, tail stiff with purpose. 2 hours into the woods, they found the first clue. A shredded collar, bright red, half buried under a log, coated with frost. Daryl picked it up. No tags? Just the faint scent of something synthetic and burnt. "Someone dumped more than one," Daryl muttered. Ice sniffed the ground, then let out a low bark. He darted ahead, then paused, looking back. "Follow me," his eyes seemed to say. They followed a narrow game trail deeper into the trees. Around midday, they reached a clearing. The wind picked up, carrying with it a stench Daryl recognized too well: fear, blood, and ash. In the middle of the clearing stood a metal cage, small, rusted, and twisted like someone had tried to destroy it. Nearby, ashes and charred wood revealed an old fire pit, and beside it, lying half hidden beneath branches, was a motionless shape: a pup. Daryl rushed forward, heart in his throat. It wasn't moving. He fell to his knees beside it and placed a hand on its small chest, cold but still. No rise, no breath. "Damn it," he whispered, closing the pup's eyes gently. "I'm sorry, little one." Ice sat beside him, silent. Then, another sound, a soft, rasping whimper. Daryl snapped around. Behind the cage, wedged between rocks, was another puppy, barely bigger than a football, covered in mud and trembling violently. Its eyes were burned with terror. Daryl moved slow. "It's okay. I'm not like them." The pup flinched, but didn't run. He scooped it up into his coat, pressing it close to his chest. "You're safe now." Ice wagged his tail once, then barked low. From deeper in the trees, more whimpers echoed. Daryl froze. How many did they leave out here? They moved carefully, following the sound. Behind a fallen pine, inside a makeshift wooden crate, were 2 more pups, alive, weak, but breathing. Daryl couldn't believe it. He set down the rescued pup gently, then opened the crate and knelt beside them. "I got you," he said softly. "You're not alone anymore." He radioed Kara. "I've got 3 live pups, 1 deceased. We're 2 miles north of Stillwater Ridge." She gasped. "You found them?" "I didn't. Ice did." They waited until help arrived. Kara brought blankets, warm fluids, and 2 deputies. The dogs were loaded into her SUV, wrapped tight and cared for. Daryl placed a hand on Ice's head. "You didn't just save them," he whispered. "You tracked them like a born K9, no hesitation, no fear." Ice licked his wrist, eyes shining. And in that moment, Daryl knew this wasn't over. Because someone had left these pups to die. And Ice had just uncovered a trail that someone might not want followed. Back in Dalton, the town had started whispering. When word spread that a retired firefighter and a young K9 German Shepherd had tracked and rescued 3 abandoned pups from the woods, people called it a miracle. Local news ran a short story. The vet clinic got calls. But behind the praise, there was unease. Because no one knew who had dumped those dogs, or why. Daryl hadn't stopped thinking about it. He stood in the barn behind his cabin, working by lamplight as Ice dozed nearby. The other pups were recovering at the clinic. Ghost was stronger too, walking with only a slight limp now. But Daryl's thoughts were elsewhere. He kept staring at the red collar they'd found. It had a thin strip of nylon stitched inside, and, under better light, he noticed something. Faint ink. A partial logo, almost burned away. He grabbed his old phone, took a photo, and enhanced it. "MC," he read aloud, or maybe MK. He frowned. The letters meant nothing alone. But his years as a first responder had taught him to recognize equipment codes. They marked gear that had been sold to police departments, training facilities, and breeding kennels. He reached for the list Kara had pulled last week, the one with registered military K9 breeders in the state. Only 3 in the region. One stood out. Macklin K9 Academy, about 20 miles east, closed down 6 months ago after an investigation into misuse of funds. Rumors of abuse, lost dogs, and disappeared pups had swirled, but nothing was proven. Until now. Daryl loaded Ice into his truck. The road to Macklin was rough, mostly dirt and snow, with old fencing sagging in places and a crooked mailbox covered in rust. The property was supposed to be abandoned, but a dim light flickered in the barn. He pulled up slowly, engine off. "I don't like this," he muttered. Ice let out a low growl, barely audible. Daryl grabbed a flashlight and stepped out. "Stay close, buddy." The barn door was slightly open, creaking as the wind pushed against it. Daryl stepped inside and froze. Rows of old crates lined the walls, some empty, some not. In the far corner, a man stood hunched over a table. Gray hair, flannel jacket, thick boots. He didn't turn. "I don't allow visitors," he called without looking up. "You Macklin?" Daryl asked calmly. The man turned then, slow, eyes narrow. "Who's asking?" Daryl stepped forward. "I'm the one who found your dogs in the woods, or what's left of them." The man's jaw twitched. "I don't know what you're talking about." 3 pups, dumped in freezing temperatures, 1 dead, 1 nearly eaten by coyotes, all wearing your gear. Macklin took a step closer. "You got no proof." Ice growled again, standing between them. Daryl didn't blink. "You sold government-trained dogs into private hands without oversight. When things got too hot, you cut loose the ones that weren't profitable. You better leave." Daryl took another step forward, lowering his voice. "You left them to die. And this one?" He pointed to Ice. He remembered their scent. tracked them, saved them. You didn't breed a litter of failures. You created survivors. But you're the one who broke. Suddenly, Macklin reached into his coat. Fast. Daryl's instincts roared. He stepped back. Ice lunged. In a blur, the pup shot forward, teeth flashing, not to maim, but to disarm. His jaws locked around Macklin's wrist just as the man pulled out a rusted hunting knife. Macklin screamed and dropped the blade. Daryl tackled him against the wall, ripping the knife away and pinning him. Sirens echoed in the distance. Kara had been tracking the GPS from the truck. Backup was on the way. Minutes later, the sheriff arrived. Cuffs snapped into place, and Macklin was dragged out into the snow, cursing the dog that had taken him down. Daryl looked at Ice, panting, tail wagging slow but proud. "You've got something in your blood," he said. "Discipline, loyalty, fire. But what makes you different?" He crouched and scratched behind Ice's ears. Is your heart." Back at the cabin that night, Ghost curled up near the fire. The pups were safe, and Ice lay beside Daryl on the old couch. "You didn't just find them," Daryl whispered. "You gave them a future." But he wasn't finished yet, because the town that had once turned its back was about to see what one man and one rescued canine could build, together. Spring came late to Dalton. The snow began to melt in slow patches, revealing muddy ground and the first brave blades of green grass pushing through. The frozen silence of winter had started to give way to birdsong and laughter, and to something the town hadn't felt in years: hope. It had been 3 weeks since Macklin's arrest. Local news picked up the story again, this time with faces. Pictures of the rescued pups recovering at the clinic. Footage of Ice, alert and calm beside Daryl in front of the sheriff's office. And interviews with Kara, who couldn't stop smiling. But Daryl didn't care about the cameras. He cared about what came next. He stood in the field behind his cabin, hammer in hand, eyes on the wooden arch he had just finished setting into the soil. Above it, painted by Yingd in bold black letters, the Ice House, Canine Healing and Training Center. It was more than a name. It was a promise. Not just to the pups they'd saved, but to every working dog discarded, abused, or forgotten. This place would be a sanctuary, a second chance for the four-legged heroes who gave everything and asked for nothing. Ice stood beside him, tail swaying, tongue out in the warm breeze. Ghost was nearby, keeping a lazy watch over the 3 now thriving puppies who wrestled each other in the dirt and barked at butterflies. Daryl smiled, but his mind wandered. He remembered the day he carried Rex, his old firehouse canine, into a burning home to rescue a child. The boy had survived. Rex didn't. For years, Daryl had buried the guilt, the pain, but Ice had brought something back, not just memories. Purpose. The pup had grown lean and fast, his coat thick and glossy, his eyes sharp. He had a quiet confidence, the kind that made people listen. When Daryl took him to speak with local schools, Ice would sit proudly beside him, letting children pet his ears and whisper secrets into his fur. He wasn't just a dog anymore. He was a symbol. A few days later, the grand opening of the Ice House drew a small crowd. Veterans, families, a few cops from the local K-9 unit, and even the mayor, who handed Daryl a plaque that read, "For service beyond the badge." Kara stood beside him, clapping with tears in her eyes. "You did it," she whispered. Daryl shook his head. "He did it." Ice barked once, as if in agreement. Over the following weeks, more dogs arrived. Some from shelters, some from old units that had disbanded, some handed over by families who couldn't afford the care. Each one met Ice first, and somehow, each one followed his lead. The puppies they had rescued from the woods grew stronger. One of them, now named Blitz, showed early signs of becoming a search and rescue natural. Another, Nina, had a gift for calming veterans with PTSD. The smallest, Tank, had legs too short for field work, but made the perfect therapy dog for local nursing homes. And then there was Ghost, who never left. She became the quiet guardian of the center, watching from the porch with wise eyes and a slow, steady tail wag. One night, after the last kennel was locked and the moon had risen above the pines, Daryl sat on the porch with Ice beside him. The wind rustled the trees. An owl called in the distance. "People think dogs don't remember," Daryl said softly. "But I think they remember everything. And sometimes, they forgive faster than we deserve." Ice rested his head on Daryl's boot. "You're not just a survivor," Daryl continued. "You're the reason others get to survive too." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small badge, one he'd made for Ice. It wasn't gold or shiny, just simple black with silver engraving, Honor Unit 01. He clipped it to the pup's collar. Ice looked up, tail thumping softly. "You earned it." As the stars glittered above them, Daryl leaned back in his chair, eyes closing. He wasn't the same man who once walked frozen lakes alone, lost in grief. And Ice wasn't the trembling pup left to die on cracked ice. They had rescued each other, and together they had built something the world desperately needed. A place where broken became brave and forgotten became family. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who believes in second chances. Because sometimes, the ones we save are the ones who save us.